may be seated. Well, I want to begin by asking you a question. How many of you, as a part of your family Christmas tradition, watch movies during Christmas? Anybody watch movies? Yeah? What's your favorite Christmas movie? Elf. That's Suzanne's favorite Christmas movie. What else? Miracle on 34th Street. That's a classic. The Muppets Christmas Carol. Okay, all right. Well, I like the George C. Scott version myself, but you like the Muppets. Okay. To each his own. What else? It's a Wonderful Life. That's probably the Christmas movie of Christmas movies, right? How about Westerns? Anybody like Westerns? No Western Christmas movies? No? No Magnificent Seven? Well, I want you to imagine with me. Now that you've seen your Christmas movies, just imagine that you're in a Western and you are stuck in your fort. You are behind enemy lines and you're taking fire from the enemy. I mean, they're coming after you and you're running out of ammunition and it doesn't look good. You're about to raise the white flag and surrender and just say, I give up. We can't win this. And then just before you're about to do that, you start to feel the ground rumble beneath your feet. And you start to hear faint sounds of trumpets in the distance. And you start to hear hoofbeats getting louder and louder and louder. And all of a sudden, you're starting to feel hopeful. Why? Because the cavalry is coming. Defeat is no longer imminent. Help is on the way. And so you have hope. I submit to you that the book of Ruth that we're going to look at this morning can be looked at that way. It's a story of help that is on the way. It's a story about the cavalry coming. Now, most people don't think so, because most people, when they think of the book of Ruth, they think of an ancient, dramatic love story. And it is that. It is. I mean, if you're familiar with the book of Ruth, it is very dramatic. It begins with a man and his family leaving their homeland because of a famine in search of food. And so they travel many miles seeking to feed themselves, only to find things going from bad to worse, because when they get into this foreign land, all of the men in the family die. Well, now, the wife, Naomi, and her daughters-in-law are by themselves. And Naomi and Ruth, one daughter-in-law, decide to head back to Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. They go back and try to eke out a living and provide for themselves. And while they're there, there's a chance encounter between Ruth, the young widow, and a man named Boaz. And this man, Boaz, is in a position to help, but his hands are tied. He can't do anything because there's another family member who needs to be brought up to speed. He needs to be told about the situation of Naomi and Ruth and given an opportunity to help. But the question arises, well, who is this other man? Is he friendly? Is he going to be helpful? Or is he going to take advantage of Naomi and Ruth? But he needs to be given an opportunity to help. Well, it turns out he has no interest in helping Ruth and Naomi and says, Boaz, you can take it. I want nothing to do with those two women. And so Boaz does take responsibility. He marries Ruth. They have a child, and they live happily ever after. I mean, it's the stuff that movies are made of. It's a dramatic love story. But I submit to you, it is much more than that. The book of Ruth, in its details, points to a much more dramatic story, a much larger story a story of a work that God is doing and that He's continued to do up until our day. The book of Ruth is actually an introduction to the coming Messiah. And it is this coming Messiah who would be God's final Redeemer. And so we're going to take a survey of the book of Ruth this morning. We're going to walk through each chapter and we're going to see three things. We're going to see the reason for the Messiah's coming. Why did God have to send him? The book of Ruth is going to answer that question for us. We're also going to see the actions that the Messiah will take. When the Messiah shows up, what is he actually going to do? We're going to see an example of that in the book of Ruth. And finally, this little narrative is going to introduce us to who the Messiah is. We're going to see the person of the Messiah so that he is recognizable when he comes on the scene. And so the reason for the Messiah's coming, the actions that he will take, and the person that he is. Each one of these three messianic identifiers is present in the book of Ruth. And we're going to see all three. And so let's begin by looking at the reason for the Messiah's coming. Why did God have to send him? Open your Bibles, if you haven't already, to the book of Luke. I'm sorry, the book of Ruth. Ruth is the classic text for Christmas, but we're going to look at Ruth. Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. Now here, I want to pause for a moment because the author points out a very interesting detail about when this story takes place. It is during the time before the nation of Israel had a king. It was during the days when the judges ruled. Now, those of you that know about those times, what was it like when the days that the judges ruled the land? Josue, you're shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head? It wasn't good. Why wasn't it good? People did what was right in their own eyes. That's how the book of Judges ends. The very last verse of the book of Judges says that people did what was right in their own eyes. That's the last verse before we get to the book of Ruth. Now, that wasn't always the case, because when God's people came into the promised land under Joshua's leadership, Joshua told them, serve the Lord your God, fear him, honor the Lord, that it may go well with you. And the people did. The nation of Israel honored God. They served God. They did that the entire time while Joshua was alive and while all of his leadership was alive. All of the elders of Israel, while they were alive, people walked in fellowship with God. They didn't do what was right in their own eyes. They did what was right in God's eyes until Joshua died and all of the elders of that generation died. And then a new generation rose up that didn't know Joshua or what God had done for the nation. And so people started doing what they thought was right, according to their own judgment. Let me read for you what those days were like. Concern for the adherence to the Torah, that is God's law, decreased, resulting in social, political, and spiritual degradation. Social obligations toward the weaker members of society were neglected. Covenantal standards of sexual conduct were openly violated. Tribal leadership condoned the kidnapping of Israelites by Israelites, and idolatrous and covetous practices were institutionalized by members of the priestly tribe. The clergy had been corrupted. So the nation was living in rebellion towards God, and the clergy had been corrupted. That is what the author means when he says the people were living in the days when the judges ruled. Now, that time, as you can imagine, was a time of spiritual and social chaos and darkness, just by that description that we read. And why was that? Because God's word was being abandoned and ignored. People didn't feel they needed to follow God's word anymore. And so it resulted in spiritual and social chaos and darkness in the land. Now, let me remind you what God said would happen when people live this way. According to Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 17 and 18, 23 and 24, God says this: "Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb. The heavens over your head shall be bronze, and the earth under you shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of your land powder." Now, what effect do you think that would have on the food supply? It would cut it off, right, Joe? Food wouldn't grow. There's no rain. In order for crops to grow, they have to be watered. And so, based on these details, living in the time when the judges ruled, doing what's right in your own eyes, and God disciplining and judging the land, read Ruth 1:1 one more time. "In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons." What's really going on here? In the time when the judges ruled and people were doing what is right in their own eyes, there is judgment on the land and there is a famine. The famine is a result of God's discipline and judgment because people are living their way rather than God's way. And as a result, this man and his family leave town in search of food to provide for themselves. Now, question, what should this man had done rather than leave town? Think about the prophets Isaiah and Daniel when they were living in a land during a time of social rebellion. What did they do? They prayed, and they confessed the sins of the nation, and they confessed their own sins. This is what Elimelech should have done. And they acknowledged God's justice and discipline as being right. Elimelech should have said, "Lord, you're right and good in bringing famine and discipline on the land because we are living in a way that is dishonoring to you." So he should have confessed the sins of the nation, confessed his own sins, acknowledged God's goodness in bringing discipline and judgment. And then he should have asked for mercy, that God would stay his hand upon his family and graciously provide the food that he needs. That's what he should have done, but he didn't. Instead, he takes matters into his own hands, and he leaves Bethlehem and goes to Moab. Well, what happens? Look at verses 2 through 5 with me. Ruth chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. "The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. Both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband." They just went from the frying pan into the fire, didn't they? They left town in search of food, and the husband and his 2 sons end up dying. What did these men need more than they needed food? They needed God. That's what we all need when we're under the discipline and judgment of God, don't we? We need God. Specifically, we need His mercy and we need His grace. And herein is the reason why God sent the Messiah, to dispense His mercy and His grace. You see, because the days of the judges, all the social and spiritual chaos and darkness that was going on in the days of Ruth, resulting in God's discipline and judgment, is not unlike our day, is it? Isn't that the same as what's going on in 21st century America? That people are doing what is right in their own eyes. Rather than submit to the Word of God, we submit to our own judgment. Only we don't put it that way. We like to kind of dress it up. We say things like, I'm following my heart. Oh, isn't that sweet? She's just following her heart. That sounds so innocent. That sounds so right, huh? To follow your heart. Until you understand what God says about the unredeemed heart. That it is desperately sick. It is incurably wicked. And nobody understands it. In other words, why would you follow your heart? Because your unredeemed heart will lead you astray. And so the last thing we want to do is follow our heart. That's why men never say stuff like that. Men never say, I just followed my heart. That's because we want to sound more independent, right? We want to sound more self-assured, right, Dylan? We want to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We want to dance to the tune of Frank Sinatra. How many of you have been to a memorial service where you've heard Frank Sinatra's song played? Just what? You got to be of the older generation. Nothing wrong with that. I've heard it. And if you go to enough, you too will hear it. Frank Sinatra's famous song that is almost always played at every memorial service. Now, I thought about singing it for you, but I don't want to give you an excuse to leave early. And so I'm going to read it, and then you can fill in the tune in your head. You'll recognize it when you hear it. Frank Sinatra sings this. I've lived a life that's full. I've traveled each and every highway. And more, much more than this, I did it my way. I did it my way. That's what men say, right? I did it my way. If you're of my generation, there was a singer named Bobby Brown. He said it was my prerogative. I did it my way. I did what I wanted to do. Nobody can tell me what to do. However you phrase it, I followed my heart. I did it my way. I followed my own prerogative. Basically, it's the same thing as saying, I'm doing what is right in my own eyes. Yeah. When you do it your way, that's where you go. So don't do it your way. Do it God's way. So people have not changed since the days of the judges. And let me remind you of another verse that gives a dire warning of doing what is right in our own eyes. It's Proverbs chapter 14:12. Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And so if we want to live life our way instead of God's way, that's the end of the road. Yet people still live that way, thinking that they know best. Nothing has changed in millennia. People are still doing what is right in their own eyes. Also, if people haven't changed, God certainly hasn't changed. And so the judgment and the discipline of God is still being meted out on people for living life their way. Judgment and discipline. God doesn't want us to run from those. It's a natural consequence of forsaking his law. And so the discipline and judgment will come. But rather than run from trouble, rather than try to fend for ourselves, what does God want us to do? He wants us to run to him. He wants us to seek after him. And that's why God sent his Messiah, so that we could run to him for mercy and plead for leniency. It's like this. You may have experienced this. You get pulled over for a traffic violation. You see the red lights, you pull over, you know that you've done something wrong, and you're hoping that the officer will be lenient. He has every right to give you a ticket, but you're hoping that he doesn't, right? So you pull over, comes up to the window, license and registration, please. Looks at it, looks at you, and says, "Sir, madam, I don't know where you're from, but this is not Hollywood. In this town, we make complete stops at stop signs. And so you deserve a citation for rolling through that stop sign. I know you're in a hurry, but I'm going to give you a warning this time. Just be sure that you come to a complete stop when you're in my town." Thank you, officer. Merry Christmas. That's mercy. That's not receiving judgment or a citation when you deserve one. Because God sent his Messiah, we can ask God for mercy. That's what the tax collector did in Luke chapter 18. You remember the Pharisee and the tax collector went to the temple to pray? The tax collector couldn't even look up to heaven, but he bowed his head sheepishly and said, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And God was. He extended mercy, and that man was forgiven. So mercy is available because the Messiah has come. But so is grace. Grace is also available. Grace takes mercy to the next level. If mercy is not receiving the traffic citation from the officer, grace is that very same officer. Before he lets you go, he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a ticket to the policeman's ball and says, "Here, I want to give this to you. Invite your wife and your family. Come to the policeman's ball." That gift is completely unexpected and undeserved. That is an act of grace. And the Messiah has opened the door for us to receive God's mercy and grace. And so, when you find yourself on the receiving end of God's discipline and judgment, not necessarily for anything that you have done. Remember, Elimelech, when he left Bethlehem for Moab, doesn't say that he sinned or did anything wrong. It just says that he left. He was in the crossfires of God's judgment upon the land for their disobedience. He was just receiving the consequences of living among disobedient and rebellious people. And so we could experience the discipline and judgment of God simply because we are living in a land of disobedient and rebellious people, not because of our own sins. And so if we find ourselves in that situation, we need to do what Elimelech should have done. Confess the sins of our nation. Confess our own sins, because even though we may not be guilty of something worthy of punishment then and there, we know that we've not loved the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, right? We know that we've not loved our neighbor as ourselves. So we have sins to confess as well. Confess the sins of the nation. Confess our own sins. Acknowledge that God is right and just for disciplining the land and bringing his judgment. but then cry out for mercy. God, have mercy upon me, a sinner. And then ask Him for His grace to graciously provide what you need, what you feel like you're lacking. And God will provide. That's what the Messiah does. That is the promise that God makes. Grace and mercy are available. So in short, don't run from trouble. Don't try to run from God. Don't take matters into your own hands. Pray and ask God for His mercy and for His grace. That's why He sent His Messiah. Now, what does God's grace and mercy look like specifically? For that, we'll pick up the story in Ruth chapter 2. Flip over to Ruth chapter 2. We'll read beginning at verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go into the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now keep in mind, Ruth is Naomi's daughter-in-law. They had come back from Moab after their husbands died. And so now they're back in Naomi's hometown of Bethlehem. They're trying to eke out a living. They're trying to provide for themselves. And Ruth says to her mother-in-law, "Let me go scavenge some grain." That's what the word glean means. Let me just go pick up what's left over, what may be at the sides of the field, just so that we can have enough grain to maybe make a loaf or two of bread. Let me go glean. Let me find some food. And Naomi says, in the modern vernacular, "You go, girl. That's a great idea. I like to eat. Go glean your heart out." And so she does. She goes and she gleans. And notice verse 3. The author of the story says, she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Now, that would have been, Elimelech is Ruth's father-in-law, late father-in-law. But notice Ruth just so happened to come to that part of the field. Did she really just so happen? Was it purely an accident? Absolutely not, because Proverbs 16:9 says, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." Right? Ruth didn't just happen to wander into the right field. It wasn't by accident that she landed in this field belonging to a man of Boaz. God directed her steps, didn't He? He sent her directly to where He wanted her to go. He sent her to where she needed to go. And that's how God works in the lives of His people. Even when we don't realize it, God is orchestrating the details of our lives. God is, He's leading us in the direction that He wants us to go and that is good for us. And God is providing for us right under our nose, even though we don't realize it. We plan our way, but God establishes our steps. Now, fast forward to chapter 2, verse 19. It's evening. Ruth has been gleaning all day. She's come back home. And in chapter 2, verse 19, we read, "And her mother-in-law said to her, 'Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you.'" Now, I want to pause here again because in verse 17, we're told how much grain Ruth was able to glean. Verse 17 says, she brought home about an ephah of barley. An ephah. How much is an ephah? About a half a bushel. That's helpful. How many knows what a half a bushel is? Yeah. Okay. About half full. What some modern translations say, so if you take a half a grocery, maybe your Trader Joe's bag that they give you, fill that up halfway with rice or wheat or barley. How much do you think it would weigh? Some translations say 30 pounds. So just scavenging grain, Ruth managed to collect 30 pounds of grain. And so with that in mind, think about how Naomi would feel when Ruth came home with all that grain. She wasn't just neutral. She would have said something like, "Girl, where have you been today? Where did you get all of this grain? God bless the man who must have helped you and took notice of you." Naomi is excited. She is perhaps even astonished by the amount of grain that Ruth brought home. Now look at the rest of verses 19 and 20. So she, that is Ruth, told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Now Naomi is really excited. If she was excited about 30 pounds of grain, here she is beside herself because this man, Boaz, is a close relative. He is one of their redeemers. Now, question, what is a redeemer? In that day, a redeemer was a relative who was obligated to come to the aid of a family member who had either lost a piece of property or who had lost their husband. And so the Redeemer had a social and moral responsibility to come to the aid of either a widow or another family member and provide economic relief and social stability to help them make it in life. The Redeemer was either responsible to marry the widow or to purchase the property so that the family could purchase it back in the future. And so this is why Naomi was so excited, because she and Ruth were eking out their existence. They were both widows. They needed help. They were struggling to survive. And here Boaz comes along, and he is a relative who is in a position to help. He is a redeemer. And plus, he's already taking a liking to Ruth by helping her with all of this grain. And so Naomi is thinking, help is on the way. She's thinking the cavalry is coming. Right? She can hear the trumpets in the distance. Boaz is the family redeemer. But there's something else that we need to know about redeemers. Not all redeemers redeem. Because in order to be a redeemer, you have to act positively and fulfill your obligations and responsibility as a redeemer. A person could have the title redeemer, but not do anything to come to the aid of his family members. So he would be a redeemer in name only. And so just because a person is a redeemer doesn't mean that they are going to do what needs to be done for the good of the family. Another thing to take note of is that there can be more than one redeemer in a family. In fact, if there are more or multiple redeemers, there's a hierarchy of redeemers. And the closest relative is the primary redeemer. And so it works kind of like this. I use myself as an example. I imagine myself running into hard times. My house is in foreclosure. I'm about to lose it to the bank. But rather than turn it over to the bank, I want to sell it. And I want to sell it to a family member so that hopefully in the future, when I get back on my feet, I'll be able to buy it back if I can. Now, I may have a couple of redeemers in my family, an uncle and a cousin. But if I have a cousin who is maybe more well off than my uncle, he has a better paying job, he's more stable, he's in a better position to buy my house than my uncle is, my cousin needs to defer to my uncle because he's the closer relative, right? My uncle is my dad's brother, but my cousin is my dad's brother's son or daughter. So it's one relative removed. So the uncle, even though he may not be as financially stable, has to be given priority to redeem me and my house. That's what's going on here in Ruth chapter 2 and 3. By the way, you notice in some of your Bibles that the term kinsman redeemer is used. Now, that term kinsman redeemer is done just for emphasis, because if you remember our definition of a redeemer has to be next of kin, otherwise he's not a redeemer. He has to be related to the person that he is qualified to redeem. If there's no relation, he's not a redeemer. So to call a redeemer a kinsman redeemer is like calling ice cubes cold or fires hot, right? It's almost a redundancy, but it's done for emphasis. There's no difference between a kinsman redeemer and a redeemer. They're one and the same. And so I say that just for clarity so that there's no confusion. But notice that Boaz is one of the redeemers. We see that at the end of verse 20. And so now I want to ask you to turn to Ruth chapter 3. We're going to continue our survey through Ruth chapter 3. We're looking for what the Messiah will do when he comes. We're going to get there in just a moment. As you're turning to Ruth chapter 3, I want to set this up a little bit. At the beginning of this chapter, Naomi says to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" And so Naomi is seeking stability, rest for the life of her daughter-in-law, and Boaz, this one who is a redeemer, is in the best position to help. And so Naomi is trying to and is about to set up Ruth so that she can go and perhaps make herself available to Boaz. And that's what she suggests. Naomi tells her daughter-in-law, "Doll yourself up, put on your best dress, get your most expensive perfume, splash it all over you, because Boaz is working in the field tonight. Go pay attention to where he's working. After he finishes, after he has dinner, pay attention to where he goes and lays down to sleep. And then after he's fast asleep, uncover his feet and lay at his feet. And then he'll tell you what to do next." Naomi says you have to be very careful, be very quiet, be very stealthy. Don't make a scene, but just do what I suggest, and then he'll take it from there. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story. Ruth chapter 3, beginning at verse 8. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over. Behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made the last kindness greater than the first, and that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true, I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he will not redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until morning. Pause right there. What just happened? Ruth did exactly what Naomi suggested. She went, uncovered Boaz's feet. He found her, and she proposed marriage to Boaz. That's what it means when she said, "Spread your wings over your servant." That was an ancient figure of speech asking for protection and provision. In fact, Boaz himself used that same expression in chapter 2, verse 12. And in Psalm 17, 8 and 9, we see that phrase being applied to God, who spreads his wings over his people. And so Ruth is saying to Boaz, protect me and shelter me as my husband, as God provides, protects, and shelters his people. So she is asking Boaz to be her husband. Not because she fell madly in love with him, but because he was a redeemer, because he had an obligation to marry her as the redeemer and to perpetuate the family line. But isn't it interesting that Boaz is not put off by this? He doesn't say, whoa, wait a minute, you're going a little fast here, aren't you? Doesn't tell her to slow down. Instead, he blesses her and praises her and causes her a worthy woman. And then he offers a mild correction. Notice he says in verse 12, it's true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. I may be a cousin, but there's an uncle, and we need to give him the first opportunity to redeem you. So Boaz is aware that he has a responsibility, but he also knows that he is not first in line. And so being a man of integrity, he defers to this other guy and gives him priority. After their conversation, Boaz tells Ruth, lay back down, but then go home in the morning, which she does before anybody can detect her. Boaz then goes into the city, presumably to look for Redeemer number one. And then guess what happens? The Redeemer whom Boaz was referring to happened to come by. There we go. There's God again, pulling the strings, doing what he needs to do, what his people need to have done, making arrangements for their good. It just so happened that he came by. Well, it didn't just so happen, but Boaz calls the guy over, and then he calls over 10 of the elders of the city and says, let's all sit right here at the city gate, and we're going to have a business meeting. I've got something that I need to say to my friend, my relative, Redeemer number one. And so turn to Ruth chapter 4, beginning at verse 3. Ruth chapter 4, beginning at verse 3. Then he, that is Boaz, said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. What just happened? Redeemer number one wanted the land, but he did not want Ruth. The moment that Boaz told the Redeemer, okay, you said you want to redeem it? Good, go ahead and buy it. The moment that you do, you also acquire Ruth, the Moabite widow, because you need to perpetuate the line of our brother and keep his heritage going. And then what did he say? I cannot. He did a complete about face and emphatically said twice, I cannot buy it. Isn't it interesting that before hearing about Ruth, he was all eager to get the land, but the moment that the familial responsibility came into the picture, he wanted nothing to do with either the land or Ruth. And so what does he do? He punts the responsibility to Boaz and says, you do it. I can't, you take it. And so here we have Redeemer number one, who was first in line to help, but was an illegitimate redeemer because he refused to do what was necessary to redeem the widow Ruth. Well, now the ball is in Boaz's court. Is he going to be a legitimate redeemer? Let's see. Look at verses 7 through 10 of chapter 4. Now, this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day, and have brought from the hand of Naomi and all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Was Boaz a legitimate redeemer? Absolutely. He was second in line, but he assumed the responsibility of the primary redeemer. And based on his actions, based on the redemption that he provided for Ruth and the family of Naomi, we see an illustration of what the Messiah will do when he comes and has come. Remember, before we get there, that the reason God sent the Messiah was to dispense grace and mercy when we find ourselves experiencing discipline and judgment. Grace and mercy is available because the Messiah has come. That's the reason God sent him. Now, based on the redemption that we see in Boaz, we have an illustration of the actions of the Messiah that he will take and has taken, and what grace and mercy look like specifically. First, grace and mercy provides for those who cannot provide for themselves. Ruth could not do anything to redeem herself. She had to let go of the land. Naomi could not take care of herself, but the Redeemer provided for them when they couldn't provide for themselves. Grace and mercy protects those who are defenseless. Widows were completely defenseless during this time. They needed a husband for security. Grace and mercy purchases security for those who are bankrupt. The land was about to be lost, and a price needed to be paid, and Boaz paid that price. Grace and mercy provides rest for those who are weary and burdened. Naomi and Ruth were stressed and struggling, but Boaz provided rest. And finally, grace and mercy embraces those who are outside of the family of God. Think about Ruth. Where was she from? The land of Moab. She was not an Israelite. She was not part of God's chosen people. She was a part of an enemy nation. Yet Boaz redeemed her and brought her into his family, into Naomi's family. And that's a picture of what the Messiah does. He provides, he protects, he gives rest, security, and he invites us into the family of God. Each of those are aspects of grace and mercy, And those are all that are dispensed, in addition to more that we'll see in just a moment through his Messiah. The only responsibility that people have is to reach out to God the way that Ruth reached out to Boaz. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. We simply need to admit that we're helpless to redeem ourselves. People need to admit that they can't purchase their own security. They can't provide their own rest. They can't get themselves into God's family without divine supernatural help. The Messiah is the only one that can provide for us, that can protect us, that can provide eternal rest and security and a place in the family of God. That's what the Messiah does. Those are some of the blessings of trusting in God's Messiah. Now, the question is, who is this Messiah? The book of Ruth has not identified him yet, but he gives us a clue at the end of the story. So, turn now to the end, Ruth chapter 4, beginning in verse 13 through 22. Keep in mind that Boaz just agreed to redeem Ruth. In verse 13 we read, So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. And Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. Herein is the end of the story. But where is the Messiah? Well, first let me ask you, who is the Redeemer mentioned in verse 14? Is it Boaz? Boaz acted as the Redeemer, but is he the Redeemer that's mentioned here? The Lord? What does verse 15 say? He shall be to you a restorer of life, nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Who did Ruth give birth to? Obed. Obed is the Redeemer. The infant Obed is the Redeemer. But how can an infant be a Redeemer? He can't do anything to provide or protect or perform the acts needed to secure a person's well-being. How can Obed be a Redeemer? He's called a Redeemer. So there must be clues related to Obed. And there are, in fact. One of them is the meaning of his name. Anyone know what the name Obed means? It means servant. So the name Obed means servant. The baby Redeemer is called a servant. It's also interesting that he is in the middle of a genealogy. He's the grandfather of King David. And he's also related to Perez, who is the son of Judah. So there is an important genealogical clue here. And if we perhaps follow Obed's genealogy, perhaps we can find out more about who he's pointing to. And so that would be a road worth traveling. But where would we find Obed's genealogy outside of the book of Ruth? Somebody said it. Matthew. Yes, indeed. Matthew chapter 1. I'm going to invite you to turn there. Matthew chapter 1, beginning at verse 1, says, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. And Judah the father of Perez, and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez the father of Hezron. Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab. Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth. And Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Now we could stop right there, couldn't we? Because that genealogy matches the genealogy that we just read in Ruth. But I want you to jump down to verse 12, and we're going to continue reading to the end of the genealogy. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel the father of Abihud, and Abihud the father of Eliakim. Eliakim the father of Azor, and Azor the father of Zadok. Zadok the father of Achim, and Achim the father of Eliud. Eliud the father of Eleazar, and Eleazar the father of Mathan, and Mathan the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. Matthew makes it crystal clear that Jesus is called Christ. What's the Old Testament term that is synonymous with Christ? Messiah. And so Matthew could very well say that Jesus is the Old Testament Messiah. Jesus is the Christ. But is he a Redeemer? He's the Christ, he's the Messiah. Is he the Redeemer? Well, for that, we can look at Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. We see that Jesus is next of kin to everybody. Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a servant by being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form. Hebrews 2:17 also says that Jesus was made in every way like his brethren, like us. And so Jesus is next of kin to everybody who is human. He's related to everybody. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus, referring to himself, said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So there's the connection to the name Obed. Obed means servant. Jesus says, I am a servant. That's why I came. And in Ruth chapter 3, verse 1, you remember Naomi was seeking rest for Ruth, right? Security and rest. Well, in Matthew chapter 11, 28 and 29, you remember what Jesus said? He said, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Rest for your soul. And then the Apostle Paul makes it even more clear than all the rest. In Galatians chapter 3:13, he says, Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. It is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree. Boaz had to pay a price. He had to pay money to redeem Ruth. Paul tells us that Christ redeemed us from breaking God's law by paying with his life. In fact, Peter in 1 Peter 1:18 and 19 says that God paid for, or Christ paid for, our redemption with his precious blood. And finally, the verse that Pastor Fernando read for us earlier, Galatians chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, saying, Abba, Father. So you're no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through God. God sent his Son at Christmas time for the sole purpose of redeeming a people for himself. That's why Jesus came. That's why God sent the Messiah, to redeem those who are under the law. That's everybody. And because we're all under the law, we are all guilty of breaking God's law. But the price has been paid for our redemption. And we saw the benefits of that redemption that Ruth provided, or that Boaz provided for Ruth: the protection, the provision, the security, the rest, the adoption into the family. That's exactly what we see happening here in Galatians chapter 4. Adoption by God. Not only that, but given the rights of a firstborn son. Even daughters are considered firstborn sons because all of God's children have the same rights and privileges. The redemption that Jesus provides also gives us the Spirit of Christ living in our hearts so that we can cry out to God and call him Father, so that we don't have to hesitate to go to him for mercy and grace when we find ourselves under the discipline of God. And finally, a heavenly inheritance is waiting for all of God's redeemed people on the other side. An inheritance. We are heirs through God because of the Messiah. Only Jesus secures all of these heavenly blessings. So at the end of Ruth, we see the baby redeemer Obed and his genealogy pointing forward to the final redeemer, Jesus. And we read all of the benefits that come with trusting in God's final redeemer. The book of Ruth is much more than a love story. It's much more than a little drama. It is full of spiritual truth. And it serves as an illustration of the much larger story of what God was doing then and what God has brought to completion when he sent Jesus, whose birth we celebrate. But the redemption is not over. It's still taking place. The grace and the mercy and the adoption are still available to everybody who would call upon the Messiah, who would call upon Jesus. Because the dark days of the judges are much like our days. People still do what is right in their own eyes. But God says, come to my Messiah, do what is right in my eyes, and I will give you rest. Boaz is an illustration of that. The actions that he took show us that the actions that Jesus has taken and will take for anyone that is willing to come under his authority. And of course, as we just seen, the genealogy of Obed makes it crystal clear that Jesus is the Messiah and he is the final Redeemer. It would be appropriate to say then that the book of Ruth is actually an introduction to the Christmas story, is it not? And Jesus is God's gift to humanity to provide for people what we so desperately need, what we can't provide for ourselves. But anyone who is humble enough to say, spread your wings over me, O Lord. Shelter me under your wings, for you are a Redeemer. Anyone who would say that can expect and believe that they will receive the grace, the mercy, and all the rest that God has provided through his Messiah. That's an open invitation to everybody today. Let's pray together. Our gracious Heavenly Father, there's so much in this story of Ruth. And even though it's taken us quite some time to cover it, there is so much more that could be said and needs to be said. So many more examples, so many more illustrations, so much more spiritual truth that can be plumbed and mined and appreciated and appropriated. But Father, you've given us a full meal this morning. We thank you for showing us Jesus in the story of Ruth. We thank you that we have redemption available to us. And we pray, Father, that if there are any that is outside, who are outside of your family, that you would move in their hearts and mind this day Cause them to cry out to you as Ruth cried out to Boaz, to spread your wings of protection over them. For you are a God of grace, mercy, love, and forgiveness.